Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition, and specifically how Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition should handle settings. Alright, so let me define my terms real quick. Settings, Dark Sun, Planescape, Spelljammer, Eberron. These are settings for Dungeons & Dragons, right? There are many. I think there are over 20 settings for Dungeons & Dragons. There are a ton of settings for Dungeons & Dragons. Mystara, Greyhawk, Aberrance. There are just a lot of settings for Dungeons & Dragons. There's even a couple of settings for Dungeons & Dragons that were so short-lived, that had so few fans that almost nobody even knows about them. I think Thunderspire. It was like there's a couple of them that are really, really super remote. There's also some really unusual Dungeons & Dragons settings like Rokugan, Oriental Adventures. You know, like those are some really unusual Al-Qadim. These are some really, really unusual settings for Dungeons & Dragons, and there's just a lot of them out there. There really are a lot of settings for Dungeons & Dragons out there. And I think it's quite arguable there are too many, like that they allowed too many to be made, right? So before we determine what 6th edition should do with settings, let's take a look at what's been done with every setting since, every single setting since the beginning of the game. And let's talk about intended, optimum, and actual, right? So, I think 1E, first edition, right? Now, each when I'm talking about a Dungeons & Dragons edition, I'm talking about hardback, PHB, MM, DMG, okay? So 1E, the first edition of the hardback, DMG, PHB, MM, what did they do with, what did that edition do with settings? Not much, right? So Greyhawk was essentially the official setting. It first came out, and there were just a few settings at the very beginning, and I can't even list them all because I feel like they're super bland, and I really don't think that they. Okay, so here's a couple things. What was the intended? The intended was to give settings that were exciting and were helpful, but I think also the intention of the design team was to make it very Tolkien-esque. Tolkien was huge in the 70s, 1974, 1978, that between that era. And so Dungeons & Dragons was essentially, in my opinion, gave a very distinct effort to do systematized Tolkien. Do Tolkien's world in a systematized manner. And you can see this in the races that are in the game. Dwarf, elf, human, they've always been in the game. And it's just a callback to Tolkien. I'm not sure that Dungeons & Dragons will ever be able to break away from its connection to Tolkien, nor am I sure if it ever should, okay? I do think we've reached a point where we can. What do I think should have been optimum? Well, believe it or not, I think in many ways, what Dungeons & Dragons 1E did was pretty close to optimum, right? And also, I think the actual was close to optimum as well. So they did what they intended to do, and it was the optimum path, and I think the actual path was very close, if not synonymous to optimum. And the reason why is, with Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition, you really didn't want to worry a lot about setting, right? The idea is, so here's the key. I think that the official setting of Dungeons & Dragons should be the every setting. The custom setting that every skilled veteran dungeon master is creating, and that the official setting of Dungeons & Dragons is the every DM setting. Like, it's custom, it's unique to each table, and it's what every DM serves their players, right? And that while Wizards of the Coast or whatever, or TSR or whatever company owns Dungeons & Dragons, they can equip people to build that primary setting, right? And the one that matters most, and the one that the game cares about the most, right? So that should be the official setting. It should always be the preeminent, the supreme setting, is not whatever TSR or WotC is creating. It's what is being created by every DM, right? That should come first. Now, I think Dungeons & Dragons should have professionally built settings that are built by people on or or attached to the design team, the rules design team, okay? All right, so I think they absolutely should, right? But first edition needed to accomplish virtually nothing. They could be almost a photocopy of Tolkien. And the reason why is it was skinned enough to, to be legal, and I think they even had a few legal troubles. But overall, it's perfectly okay to do systematized Tolkien. And the reason why is with first edition, you've just created the greatest tabletop role-playing. You've created an entire new genre of game. You've accomplished enough. You don't have to knock it out of the park at every single level of the game. Games come out and they get better, they mature as they go along. First edition did everything necessary that it could do with first edition, but its actual goals were very low. Okay, what was done with second edition Dungeons and Dragons? You're talking the 80s and the 90s, right? This was bad. Second edition was the worst when it came to settings. It was running settings that should have never been made. There were too many settings that were created in the 80s and the 90s. Many of them overlapped. They were not unique enough. There was a lot of time and effort spun up. There were too many resources hired to build them. There was a point where there were 600 employees at TSR. That's crazy. They never needed 600 employees at TSR. I would guess there's around 50 people working on Dungeons & Dragons officially at Wizards of the Coast, and that number may be as low as half of it. It might be as low as 25 who actually collect a paycheck and work on the game. And that's correct. You want to keep it tight. You don't want to have so many people working on it that they go out of business, which is exactly what happened with TSR, right? So second edition, they intended to have just a plethora of worlds, and they thought because everybody was playing so much that there would just be enough, there would be enough juice from all the players to support all these worlds. What should have been done optimally, as I think second edition should have had 4 or 5 settings max. I think they came out with 15 or 20, with like close to 15 settings, like between 10 and 15 settings. Second edition was the worst edition for settings. They way overshot the mark. They supplied too many settings. They allowed those settings to overlap. It's a bad idea, okay? Third edition. Third edition is one of the best D&D versions for settings. They focused on some great settings. Eberron, in my opinion, is the best setting to come out of third edition. But Eberron, the idea that they reached out to the community and said, we want, and ran a contest. That's what Eberron was. They ran a contest and said, we want our community of players and dungeon masters to create a setting for us. I think it's one of the most honorable things that has ever been done in the history of the game. I think Eberron is super special, and the fact that third edition did that, I think they intended to, by the way, also third edition did the OGL and allowed the game for many other companies to come in and create for free other additional worlds. This was brilliant. Ryan Dancy was in the mix. He had a big hand in making that happen. And I think it was just brilliant. Actually, the more I think about it, I think third edition was the most perfect setting for settings because it was innovative and because it was kind. It actually had the company looking out and saying, we're going to do this. We're going to work with our people, and we're going to make this happen. And it was just so unique and special that there's really never been anything like it. And they slammed the door on it, too. And I think to this day, Wizards of the Coast has never really understood what to do with Keith Baker, the creator of Eberron, right? And that really, I think he's kind of treated like a... are we still allowed to use this term? Redheaded stepchild? Yeah, I know. I'm sorry if there's a better term now. I'm almost positive there's a better term for that. But I just really feel like, he's fed and he's given some attention every now and then, but I don't think he's ever been really treated as though he was a member of the design team. And I think that's a problem. I think overall, he could have been treated better. He was he was given an opportunity, and to this day, I think Keith Baker's life is probably richer because he did Eberron, but I'm not certain of that. He has one distinct life event that he wrote about publicly that I'm curious if it was connected to Eberron, and if it wasn't worth it. But that really was more, I think that was him managing the opportunity rather than, him, like, a problem being introduced into his life by WotC. He chose to submit Eberron. He had the success come from Eberron, and he always owned managing that success. So that's a much larger story. I'm not sure if I'd ever get that because it might really, really personal in his life, but overall, I'm really curious. And I think there are topics about Dungeons & Dragons that entire books will be written on in the future because, like Marvel is a multi-billion-dollar company now, and everybody understands its importance. And I really think Dungeons & Dragons makes Marvel and DC. It's larger than it. It really is. We just don't understand that at the level of you. We don't understand that in the U.S. yet. Nobody understands the true value of Dungeons & Dragons at this point in time. And this is the 80s with Marvel, and I really feel like we'll get there. I pray we get there. We'll see. All right, so 3rd edition I really think did the best. It was most innovative. It was most kind. 3rd edition settings are just really unique and special. 4th edition. I loved how 4th edition handled, by the way, what was intended with 3rd edition and what it was optimum and what was actual was 3rd edition really intended to give settings to the world. And I think that's optimum. And I think the actual was very close to optimum, right? So what happened with 4th edition, I really loved what they did with settings in 4th edition. They focused on some older settings and highlighted them, right? So one of the ones that they focused on in 4th edition was specifically Dark Sun. There was a Dark Sun book. It was beautiful. It was awesome for 4th edition. It is one of the coolest things that came out of 4th edition. If you don't add that book, if you don't own that book, I highly recommend adding that unique book to your collection. It really is beautiful. It's just a wonderful, incredibly well executed setting book. And so I think it's really interesting what they did with it, right? Nentir Vale was fantastic. There was a really good setting book for Nentir Vale. I think Ghostwalk was kind of a setting that came out of 4th edition. I apologize, I got to back up the 3rd edition real quick. 3rd edition had these beautiful books that did setting work for Faerun, that were some of the best executed, most beautifully art and layout books, and most beautifully written books ever done. 3rd edition did some amazing official work for Faerun, okay? Loved it. 4th edition did some really solid stuff with Dark Sun. It made Nentir Vale. Nentir Vale was really unique. I really dug it, right? What has 5th edition done with settings? I love 5th edition. I think 5th edition is the best version of the game that's ever been created. I really do. I think what Mike Mearls has done is a masterpiece. Let me say it. 5th edition has done the absolute worst with Dungeons & Dragons settings. And now the game is so strong, it makes forward up in other ways. I got no beef with the overall game at the macro level, but I do not dig what they have done with settings. What 5th edition has done with settings is it has flipped every other version, okay? So every other version of the game has done the same thing with settings. Here's your setting book. Here's some adventures set in that setting, okay? What does 5th edition do with settings, right? They say, here's an adventure, and we're going to paint the tiniest areas of these settings, which we have not established in 5th edition in these adventures. So settings are mustard on the hot dog in 5th edition. They're a condiment. Settings are literally presented in 5th edition through adventures. And this is terrible. It is a terrible, terrible, terrible way to process settings. And here's the reason why. Okay. The problem with presenting settings through adventure books is that adventure books are pigeons. Okay. Dungeons & Dragons adventures are as common as pigeons, right? Pigeons are flying rats. They're common as dirt. They're a common animal, right? And adventures, Dungeons & Dragons adventures, are common as dirt. They're just so common, they're not special. You cannot make a special adventure. You cannot make a special Dungeons & Dragons adventure because you're trying to make a special pigeon. right? You could paint a pigeon gold. That doesn't make it any less of a flying rat, right? Adventures are just too fun, too cheap, too common to be a good vector for anything, right? And so presenting settings through adventure books is a horrible, terrible idea, right? And no one has liked it. No one. I do not see anyone who has said that the 5th edition is the edition that handled settings the best. One of the huge problems with this way of doing this, right, is the vast majority of these adventure books that are being created for Dungeons and Dragons, they're 200, 250 pages long. They're full color, high art, high layout. Quality of them is very good, right? But you're just throwing in little pieces of these settings, right? And you are assuming that the players know what these settings are, that the dungeon masters know what these settings are. And that's just not the case. People don't know what Faerun is. People don't know what where Strahd lives. Everybody knows the name. I'm sorry, it's slipping my mind right now. But people don't know where Strahd's homeworld is, right? And Ravenloft, sorry. So they don't understand what Ravenloft is, right? And so you're coming to these adventures, putting these little slivers of these settings into these adventures, assuming people have the background to understand where this is at. They don't. It's a terrible, terrible idea. 5th edition has done the absolute worst job of processing settings. The worst, okay? All right, so what should 6th edition do? Here's what 6th edition should do to fix this, okay? Based on where we are at in this time, okay, I think that 6th edition should process settings in the following way. 6th edition from the very beginning should announce we're going to do 3 settings, right? They should release the game and say 1 year from this date, we're going to release the first official 6th edition setting. We're going to release the first published 6th edition setting. The official setting is the every setting. I believe that strongly. They're going to say we're going to release the first edition. And then they should go out and they should say to everybody out there, all the companies out there, Dungeons & Dragons design team should not build the setting. They should say, listen, you can use our old settings, but you got to license them. You're gonna get them like a franchisee, right? You are going to rent this setting from us for 5 years, right? You will pay an initial cost of $500,000 to $1 million, I would say, okay? And then each year, you're expected to give us $250,000 to $500,000 per year, right? You can adjust these numbers. If you fail to give us our payment each year, the license reverts to us. You are no longer the franchisee, right? And then allow all the companies in the market to come in and fight for this, right? And also allow people who don't even have freestanding built companies to do this, right? I would love to see some tech billionaire from Silicon Valley pay $5 million to own the rights to publish Faerun Adventures for 5 years and put their name on every book. That would be awesome, right? And this is a really good way to do it because it allows other people in the TRPG community to get juice from the settings of Dungeons and Dragons, but it allows the design team to focus on the game and focus on the rules rather than spending their time building these settings, right? And so I think this is the best way to go. And you announce there's going to be 3. The first one comes a year out. The second one comes 2 years out from the release of 6th edition. And the third one comes 3 years out from the release of 3rd edition. And you only allow them to buy the license to create it up until that 5th year is done. So actually the first one would be a 4-year license. The second one would be a 3-year license. And the third one would be a 2-year license. That's all you get, right? And then if 6th edition gets additional time, you set up a good, solid on-ramp for them to keep that license if they're doing well with it, right? And I think this is a perfect way to handle the settings, and that is how I would handle the settings in 6th edition. That's my take. I would love to hear how you would handle doing settings in 6th edition. Please let me know, and please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you very much.